The problem is that the mineralization was situated in vertical mountainsides. So they have hired 6 Swiss mountaineers, and the idea was that they should operate in teams of 2, rappelling the way down and on the way collecting samples.
Welcome to Polar Podcasts, where you'll hear stories from geologists who've spent their careers, their lives, exploring and studying the remarkable and remote geology of Greenland. Why did they become fascinated with Greenland? What were the problems and the discoveries that drove them? And what was it like working in these remote places where few people venture, even now? I'm Julie Hollis. In this episode, we hear more from Bjørn Thomassen, Emeritus Senior Scientist, about his first job working for the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland, running a field program to study the niobium and tantalum-enriched Motzfeldt Intrusion in South Greenland.
In 1988, I was working at the Blade Jingle as mine geologist, and then the director of the Geological Survey of Greenland, Martin Gisler, phoned me and offered me a job on short notice in South Greenland, and I accepted. And it was sometime in May, so 1.5 months later I was standing on this glacier in the Motzfeldt Intrusion, some 25 kilometers north of Narsarsuaq airfield. And the story is this, that for some time, I think 5 years, a uranium exploration program supported by the Danish state and the European Commission, whatever they were called at that time, they supported uranium exploration. So the previous summers, the teams had focused in on one of the Garda intrusions in South Greenland called the Motzfeldt Intrusion. And they had found a large, diffuse occurrence of minerals containing rare earths and uranium and thorium hosted in a mineral called pyrochlore. So the survey, Geological Survey of Greenland, had got a grant of 4.5 million, a lot of money in those days, to investigate. And the problem is that the outcropping pyrochlore mineralization was situated in a vertical mountainside. So what they had done until then was geologists had gone at the foot of the cliffs, collecting loose blocks, boulders, coming up from higher up and identified the pyrochlore, and they also walked on the top of the cliffs. But no normal geologist had been able to access the proper mineralization. So they had hired 6 Swiss mountaineers, and the idea was that they should operate in teams of 2, rappelling down from the top of the cliffs, rappelling the way down and on the way collecting samples from the mineralized zone, which was more or less in the middle of the cliffs. So we set out, and at the same time we were going to fly a radiometric survey with helicopter in this alpine region. So in combination, that would should the detailed sampling and mapping and radiometric survey should give a much better understanding of the size and especially the grade of the mineralization. And to access the grade, you had to have samples, many samples. So we ended up with 1,000 samples, and that's a lot, and quite relatively large samples, at least 1 kilo, 1 to 2 kilos. A sample bag full was my instruction to the mountaineers. So we operated in that way that we flew out, the 7 of us, 6 mountaineers and me, and they were all German speaking, and it was my luck that I could speak German, and I had learned my German the previous years in Central East Greenland, where I worked as only Dane among Austrian mining engineers. So I had to adapt in those days. So for me, the German language is associated with fieldwork in Greenland, and I know a lot of, special Austrian dialect expressions for various things like tent poles and things like that. And there's still a language problem with the Swiss, because the mountaineers, they were handpicked, so they didn't know each other on beforehand. And that's not the best thing when you're putting up a team for fieldwork. It's much better that people know each other on beforehand because, all sort of small frictions they should be taken away before you go into field. But it worked out okay. But they spoke dialects. Every valley apparently in Switzerland has a dialect. And so when they spoke to me, I said, please, Hochdeutsch, official German. But between themselves, they were joking and shouting in their funny dialects. They even couldn't understand each other, what people from the various valleys. So we operated in that way that we put up camp. I remember the first cliff. There were 2 glaciers, and my friend Tapsa, who's worked there before, he had christened them Horror and Terror, because those glaciers, they were so steep. And when the sun was shining in, they were melting. And by melting, they released rock samples, and they were coming fast down. So you shouldn't be in the middle of the day in front of those glaciers. They're pretty dangerous. So we put our camp in between, and the camp consisted of caravans and 2 caravans, and then this old metal container called Solvognen.
The sun wagon.
Which had been used by other scientists nearby. And Solvogn, it was so heavy, it had to be lifted inside by Sikorsky 61, and they had to go in 3 tries to get it lifted. And they threw everything out of the helicopter, seats and all those things to reduce their weight. And then there had to be a slight wind to get a lift. And so they managed to put that container in Solvognen, but then it was very stable, standing there. And then we have the two campers. So a good camp. And then the daily routine was that in the morning the helicopter came off on Narsarsuaq and landed and took the teams on board 2 each time and put them on top of the cliff. And and then they worked their way down. I had my job, I had binocular magnificating 17 times. So in the morning I walked out in the middle of the glacier and was looking in at that cliff. Was it 1,000 meter or 500 meter? It was at least 500 meters. There were different, of course, 5 different cliffs. But the first one between Terror and Horror was pretty high. So I was standing there and they were rappelling down. And then I had this walkie-talkie. And I could direct them because beforehand I had photos taken the previous year of that steep slope, magnified, and there I had drawn parallel line, and designed a sampling program. And there was line A, B, C, D, and so on, with a distance of 50 meters. So 1 team or 2 going down in each line, and they were under instruction to collect sample at some places with a vertical distance of 25 meters, other at 50 meters. And in each sample site, they were supposed to spray paint across 2 meter by 2 meter, and then fill up the sample bag, 1 to 2 kilos of chip samples, and they should take them for each quarter of the sample sites, hanging there in the ropes, standing on a small shelf. So chip, and in the bag. And you can imagine the bag got heavier and heavier going down. At one locality number 3, they started from the foot and worked their way up. But they were quite tough people. Also, they had, from a start, a lot of equipment, mainly rope, and also those compound to secure the line, hammer into the wall and secure the lines. And they also carried a scintillometer.
A scintillometer is a handheld instrument used to measure gamma radiation, in this case, radiation emitted from the mineralized rocks.
Also weighed a couple of kilos. So they had spray paint, scintillometer, sample bags, chip sample hammer, and a mountaineering gear. So they had good heavy rucksacks, but they were strong and very fit. So I was standing there with my binocular directing them. So I said, ja, Gruppe Nummer 2, bisschen links. Ja, gut, bisschen rechts, and so on. And then they spray painted across, and I had my enlarged photo, and from that we later on produced a beautiful digital map. And when we got the analytical results, we could do data handling and plot in the analytical results and do contours, everything on computers. That was state of the art in those days. So we got very beautiful maps, but the way we did the sample was very primitive and old-fashioned, with me standing there and sketching in the sample points. So that worked out okay, and I'm very impressed by those Swiss guys. And they said, I know nothing about mountaineering. I like to walk and scramble in the mountains, but I never do climbing, real climbing. But those guys, they told me they hated the thing, because as a mountaineer, you will always look for fresh rocks where you can put in your compound and secure your lines and avoid rotten rock. But what we have here, because it's a cyanitic intrusion, and cyanite, that's a quartz poor granite in principle, and it has been heavily hydrothermally altered. That means the minerals that have been broken down by hot solutions, which at the same time have precipitated all minerals, something like that. We call it hydrothermal alteration, and that's not stable rock. That's rotten rock, as I call it. So they didn't like that. And they also told me that the biggest danger by this rappelling was actually when there are two, one is on top and the other further down the line. And they said they were so afraid that moving the line, they would loosen a rock which would fall at the head of the companion further down. And they couldn't see each other because it was a vertical cliff. So I heard on the intercom walkie-talkie, they were asking all the time, "Wo bist du? Wo bist du? Where are you?" So, I mean, you can imagine he was passing through rotten rocks, and he was afraid was his friend just below, or was it out to the side? So things like that. So it was a quite unusual project, and also because we had a lot of money for that project, we could set up a field laboratory in Narsarsuaq. So the samples, they were flown in on daily basis to the field lab in Narsarsuaq airfields, and we had bought a crusher and a mill, so we could actually pulverize the samples and took out a split 50 or 100 grams, and that we sent to commercial laboratories in Canada. All samples went to one laboratory and every 10th to another laboratory as a check. And so there were ships, the crushed and the sample powder was sent directly from Narsarsuaq there in end of August, also on a weekly basis. So it all worked smoothly. We had one accident. As I told you, on a daily basis, the mountaineers are flown up and put on top of the cliffs, and sometimes it's involved quite difficult landings. I mean, the rotor was running when the two guys were jumping out. So the pilot, he wanted a counterweight, so to speak. So he used me. So I was sitting, you had the pilot and then the co-pilot seats. I was sitting, weighting the machine down, because on the back seats he had the two mountaineers. So he put one ski on a slope, typically one ski on the slope, and then he can balance the machine and said over the intercom to the two passengers on the back seat, please step out very carefully, because he should keep the machine in horizontal status, because if it was tipping, the rotor would hit into the wall, and that should be avoided at every cost. So I was sitting there, I did like it, sitting, waiting down as a counterweight to help stabilize in that process. But that was part of the job. But then one day I remember we had visitors coming in, and I was discussing with my friend John Peterson, another geologist, came visiting, and they were flowing up without me putting the mountaineers on location in the morning. It was a jet ranger. A jet ranger is not so a powerful engine, so there wasn't so much leverage for the pilot. Suddenly we heard the helicopter, whoa, and then clang, clang. That was rotor who hit the mountain side 2 times. And then he came back, and we were so afraid. We said, he will come down in flame with 3 bodies and boards. But he managed to land that helicopter, and it appears that both rotor blades have been shorting the same And rotor blades, they're very stable. They should be absolutely balanced. They're very much about balance. So apparently he cut the same amount of the end of each rotor blade, so he managed to land. I have a fantastic picture. They sent out a Sikorsky 61 to pick up the helicopter, and it did that, took it as in a sling load because below the big Sikorsky. So I have a fantastic photo of the two helicopters, one flying away with a sling load of a smaller helicopter. The project ended up, and we did a lot of plotting, and we analyzed for 12 elements. The main elements were niobium, tantalum, thorium, and uranium. Thorium and uranium, they were just a pain in the ass because they create problems, all sort of environmental problems. But the P metals, especially tantalum and also niobium, but they're hosted in the same mineral. So to process that, you have to separate out the pyrochlore, and the other elements which could be of interest, tin and moly, tungsten, and so we analyzed for 12 elements, and I got the results, and then in the autumn I did the final report, and it's a beautiful report with a lot of color plots. It was intended, I think I had 10 classes. When you do your contouring, you make anomaly maps with the gradients, and you can say the most red part of the map is where the highest tantalum values are. That's common. And I remember we had a final meeting with the bureaucrats in the mineral administration, and I said, well, how many issues, how many volumes should we print of that report? And there were these nice fold-out maps, color maps, 25 something, and that would cost so and so much. And this type in from the ministry, he said, "Oh, that would be too expensive. You will have to print those maps in black and white." And I processed. I said, "You can't distinguish when you have 10 classes. There must be color. If not, they're useless." And said, "Well, that's not our problem. That's a problem of the survey. And if you want them in colors, you can pay for it yourself." So that report came out with, I think there were four copies with color maps in. I have one here. And the rest, which went out to institutions and industries, were useless maps. Of course, there was a text, and I made up tables with tonnage, estimated tonnage, and it's very difficult to estimate tonnage when you don't have, but you have to come up with a guess. I think I said something, 500 million tons with a few hundred ppm tantalum, and then the high-grade zones, something like that. And then nothing happened.
I'm Julie Hollis, and you've been listening to Polar Podcasts. In the next episode, we hear more from Professor Alan Nutman about dating some of the oldest rocks in the world